The total amount of salts in solution is a pretty easy measurement to make, and it's also a pretty significant indicator of water quality for at least a generalization. We tend to, there's a cutoff, if you will, between fresh water and saline water that we put at about 1,000 part per million. That's milligrams of salt per liter of solution. That's 1,000 part per million. Less than that, we call the water potable or drinkable. But their saline content, or the total dissolved solids in waters, can be quite variable, and we have varying levels in nature. Some of the highest concentrated waters on the planet are in the Michigan Basin. That's a result of the geologic history of the basin. It was surrounded by a reef complex, and then the salt got hyper-evaporated into both the groundwater as well as salt deposits into the bedrock, and then that got buried. And the groundwater to this day is very high in salt. It's concentrations as much as 400,000 part per million. My old aqueous geochemistry professor at Michigan State had a sample of Michigan Basin brine that would run like syrup. It actually was viscous. Seawater is more what we think of when we think of brine. 35,000 part per million seawater. And most of that is sodium chloride, about 85%, but the other things are in there as well: calcium, magnesium, bicarbonate, sulfate, and the traces too. And a way to think about the concentration in seawater is it's 70 grams in 2 liters. So 70 grams, a Morton salt container, or a typical cylinder of salt that you buy at the grocery store, is 700 grams. So if you take one-tenth the height of that salt container and dump the salt out, that's 70 grams. And if you put that in a 2-liter soda bottle, that'll give you 35,000 part per million, 35 milligram in a liter. So that's how much salt you're talking about. Basically the tenth of a height of a Morton salt container into a 2-liter soda bottle. It's quite a bit of salt. That's why you can taste it when you swim in the ocean. We tend to then call the cutoff about 10,000 is where we start talking about brines. In desert regions, sometimes the groundwater can be concentrated as high as brine. And so you have a saline to brine range of about 1,000 part per million to brines. In fact, some of the brines are mined. The mineral solution mining is quite common right now in northern Nevada. They're mining some of the brines for lithium. And I mentioned less than 1,000 part per million is potable for drinking, so let's get into the drinking water standards here a little bit. Generally, you want your water to be between about 100 part per million and 500 part per million. That's desirable. Anything more than 500 part per million, it can have some tastes that you don't want. It tends to be not as thirst quenching. But there are some cities that serve water as high as 800 part per million. And so generally you don't want your concentrations of salt to be lower than 100 part per million, because extremely fresh waters are not all that healthy for you either. If we kind of look at the same mathematics as we do for seawater, 350 part per million then would be 0.7 grams in 2 liters. And again, less than 100 part per million, it gets down to what we call deionized water. Sometimes it's called distilled water. Distilling is a process for making deionized water. You evaporate the water off, and you're left with water, recondense the water elsewhere, and you get a distilled water or fresh water without the salt. Another technique for making deionized water is to run it through filters. That's called reverse osmosis. Put it under pressure, run it through a filter, and remove the salts from solution. But you generally don't want waters much less than 50 part per million, at least to be drinking those commonly. So it's not healthy if your sole water intake is less than 100 part per million. You need some of the minerals that are in the water. And of course, a lot of these minerals you get in your food as well. But if you're drinking fresh water, it will tend to leach minerals out of your body. Also, there's life in water. It's an issue because 80% of the world's diseases are caused by poor water supply. That's a statistic by the World Health Organization. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. It's not something that we're too used to in the United States anymore, but it used to be. Historically, there used to be problems with waterborne diseases and pathogens. But one of the marvels of the, what do they say? One of the 7 engineering marvels of the world is the our country's water infrastructure. So what are some of the problems? We have life forms, protists, single cell eukaryote life, meaning cells with a nucleus, also helminths, which are worms, so let's just call them eukaryotes. And these require filtration out of water. It's mostly a surface water issue. These organisms tend to be too big to be living in groundwater, but they do live in surface waters, and that includes the aqueducts, because the large part of the California aqueducts run on the land surface. They include things like Giardia. Giardia is what afflicts a lot of hikers. It's usually transmitted. Most of these pests, or parasites rather, live in the intestinal linings of animals, mammals particularly. So in the case of deer, the deer leave Giardia in the water, and the Giardia test, or the shell, the fancy word for shell is test. These microscopic tests prevent the organism from being killed by even double boiling. So hikers have to carry a hand pump, reverse osmosis unit. So they carry filters in a unit with a press on it to press water through a filter to clean out the Giardia. Another one is Cryptosporidium. Usually is coming from livestock, animals that are pasturing near waterways. A very bad outbreak of Cryptosporidium happened in the Milwaukee area, where the water intakes in Lake Michigan, after a rainstorm, had incorporated Cryptosporidium from the Milwaukee River, which north of Milwaukee has a lot of dairy farms, and so after a heavy rain, a large part of Cryptosporidium ended up in the water. Again, with these tests, double boiling usually doesn't kill it. It requires filtration. And then, of course, there's bacteria, which require disinfection. The most common, or historically the worst ones that we've had outbreaks in this country with, are E. coli, cholera, the famous cholera epidemic in Chicago in 1888, typhoid fever. And the disinfection is usually chlorine disinfection. That's what's most commonly used with the water utilities. And that includes chlorine gas, hypochlorites, and chloramine, which is basically ammonia molecule with a halogen slapped on chlorine. These chlorine compounds result in a carcinogenic health concern associated with some of the byproducts that are formed. Those byproducts are easily removed from at the tap if you have a tap filtration unit attached to your faucet. So it's a pretty easy problem to contend with, and it's certainly worth having the disinfectant in the water until it gets to your tap. Haloacetic acids and trihalomethanes result from the interaction with the chlorine products with things in the water, and that's the main carcinogenic concern. Another disinfectant method is ozone and ultraviolet radiation, and this is a chosen method for a lot of bottled waters. The utilities use it too, but bottled waters sometimes use it exclusively. The only problem with it is that there's no residual disinfectant, so once you treat the water, there's nothing in the water that's continuing to disinfect the water. In the case of bottled water, I suppose that's okay if the water is sealed and doesn't get contaminated in some means. And then, of course, viruses. Treating viruses, chlorine dioxide and ozone are the most effective, and they also use UV. The first two tend to break up the protein capsid that protects the virus. The second method breaks up the DNA itself. So the incidences that we have in the news about life-borne contamination in groundwater is usually due to accidental contamination of the distribution system, and perhaps the local plumbing. Is maybe a sewage leak or something like that. It'll get into the water utility somehow. There has been natural E. coli contamination cases that occasionally make the news. One of them not too long ago was a well that was drawing water, and this happened in Canada. It was in a park, and it killed some people. The well, the E. coli in the water was actually coming from the groundwater. That concludes part 2 of my presentation, What's in My Water and Where's It From? Tune in for part 3, where we'll look at the most common contaminants that we encounter locally in groundwater and surface water.